The murder of Mia Zapata. 4 days before she lost her life, the singer had finally landed the record deal her band had chased for years. Then, on a summer night in Seattle in 1993, that future vanished, and the case would go unanswered for nearly a decade before a single thread of science cracked it open. Mia Zapata was the 27-year-old lead vocalist of the Seattle punk band The Gits, a rising figure in the city's music scene. Just days before, an Atlantic Records representative had brokered a deal to sign the band, the breakthrough they had all been working toward for years. She was on the very edge of everything she had wanted, a singer whose voice and presence had made her one of the most magnetic figures in the city's underground. What happened that night? On the night of the 6th into the 7th of July, Zapata had been drinking at the Comet Tavern on Capitol Hill, then spent time at a friend's apartment before leaving on foot at around 2 in the morning. It was a route she had walked many times, through a neighborhood she knew well. A little over an hour later, just after 3 in the morning, her body was found on a quiet street at the end of a block in the same neighborhood. She had been set upon, and her life had been taken. She had been only blocks from safety, and the short distance between where she was last seen and where she was found would haunt the investigation for years. Who could have done it? For years, no one knew. The Seattle music community was shattered. Benefit concerts were held in her name, and the investigation stalled completely. The case sat cold while the city grieved one of its own, and friends, including members of other Seattle bands, raised money for a private investigator when the official inquiry went nowhere. Years passed with no suspect and no clear lead, and it began to look like one more case that would never be answered. What finally broke it? The turning point came when Seattle's cold case unit submitted DNA evidence recovered from Zapata's body for modern testing, and the profile was uploaded to the national database in the summer of 2002. Months later, a match came back. A man named Jesus Mesquia, who had lived barely more than a mile from the scene at the time. His profile entered into the system only because of an unrelated conviction in Florida. The odds against the match being wrong were astronomical, on the order of 1 in more than a trillion. Without that single out-of-state arrest forcing his DNA into the database, he might never have been found. How was the case resolved? Mesquia, a Cuban-born man who had come to the United States in the Mariel boat lift and lived in Seattle only briefly in the early 1990s, was arrested in Miami in early 2003, and in 2004, a King County jury convicted him of first-degree felony homicide. He was given an exceptional sentence of 36 years, 10 years above the standard range, with the court citing deliberate cruelty. The conviction held on appeal, but the sentence was reversed under a Supreme Court ruling on how such enhancements must be decided, then reinstated years later. And in the end, he again received 36 years. Through it all, the DNA match remained unshaken. Where does it stand now? Mesquia passed away in custody at a hospital in Pierce County in January of 2021 at 66, closing the case for good. For Zapata's family and her bandmates, the answer had come too late to change anything. But it had come at last. A man who was a stranger to her, living a mile away, had taken a life full of promise, and only the slow accumulation of forensic science across 9 long years was able to name him. Her music and the self-defense and safety programs founded by friends in her memory have far outlived the man responsible for her loss, and her case is now cited as one of the early triumphs of cold case DNA work in the country. Zapata's case was finally answered by a single thread of DNA. The next would defy answer entirely, even with 3 people in the house the night it happened. The murder of Robert I. 79 minutes after he arrived to spend the night at a friend's home in Washington, a frantic call to emergency services reported that an intruder had set upon him. Almost nothing about that story would survive scrutiny. And yet, more than 18 years later, no one has ever been charged with taking his life. Robert Wone was a 32-year-old attorney, a graduate of a prestigious firm who had just become general counsel at Radio Free Asia and was about to lead a national bar association for Asian Pacific American lawyers. He was, by every account, a careful and accomplished man with a bright future, married and living in the Virginia suburbs. On an August night in 2006, he arranged to stay over at a row house near DuPont Circle shared by an old college friend, Joseph Price, Price's partner Victor Zaborski, and a third housemate, Dylan Ward, after working late in the city. It was a short, ordinary plan, the kind of favor an old friend grants without a second thought. He arrived at around 10:30 in the evening. What did responders find? Paramedics found one on a sofa bed with 3 nearly identical wounds, almost no blood at the scene, and no signs that he had tried to defend himself. Investigators noted there were no signs of forced entry, and a knife left out did not match his wounds. The intruder's story began to fall apart almost immediately. What did the evidence suggest? Detectives came to suspect the scene had been staged, that one may have been incapacitated beforehand, and that the men in the house knew far more than they were telling. The near total absence of blood, the lack of any defensive injuries, and the suggestion that he had been cleaned and redressed all pointed away from a random break-in and toward something planned. Adding to the strangeness, months later, the brother of one of the housemates broke into the very same house and made off with thousands of dollars in electronics, a burglary investigators later said had derailed plans that were already in motion. Police indicated they had been close to an arrest before that second crime scrambled their timeline. What charges followed? In 2008, prosecutors charged the 3 housemates with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence, but never with the act itself. The choice spoke to a hard truth. Investigators believed the men knew what had happened, but could not prove who had done it. What did the court decide? After a trial heard by a judge rather than a jury, all 3 were acquitted in 2010. Judge Lynn Leibovitz stated plainly that she did not believe the intruder's story and was morally certain the men knew who was responsible, but said the evidence had not met the standard for conviction. It was an extraordinary moment. A finding of disbelief from the bench, paired with an acquittal. The law unable to bridge the gap between what the judge believed and what could be proven. None of the 3 was ever charged with taking one's life itself. Was there any other reckoning? One's widow, Catherine, brought a wrongful loss civil suit seeking $20 million, which was settled out of court in 2011 after the defendants invoked their right to silence in depositions rather than answer questions under oath. It was the closest the case ever came to any form of accountability, and even then, no one explained what had happened in that house. Where does it stand now? The case remains officially unsolved, with no one ever charged in connection with his loss. The housemates reportedly changed their names and scattered to other cities, 2 of them to Miami and Seattle, while 1 remained in Washington. A 2-part documentary released in 2023 revived national attention. And around the 18th anniversary, Wone's family and supporters continued to press publicly for answers through a memorial campaign. A respected young lawyer lost his life in a house with 3 other people present. A judge said openly that the truth was being hidden, and still the person responsible has never been named. In the Wone case, no one was ever charged. In the next, someone was convicted, served years behind bars, and then walked free when the case against him fell apart. The murder of Chandra Levy. On the 1st of May in 2001, a young intern canceled her gym membership online from her Washington apartment. It was the last trace of her that anyone would find for more than a year, and her disappearance would ignite a national obsession, topple careers, and end in a conviction that did not last. Chandra Levy was a 24-year-old intern at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, weeks away from earning her master's degree from the University of Southern California. She was bright, ambitious, and at the very start of what looked like a promising career in Washington. The kind of young woman who had moved across the country to be at the center of things. She was also, in secret, romantically involved with a married California congressman who represented her hometown, a detail that would turn her case into front-page news for months and make her name synonymous with one of the biggest political scandals of its era. Why did the case explode? When Levy vanished, reporters surfaced the affair, and the congressman became the focus of relentless speculation that consumed the summer of 2001. Investigators confirmed the relationship through forensic evidence, with an FBI biologist later testifying that genetic material recovered from Levy's apartment matched the congressman, who acknowledged the affair, though he was never charged and was ultimately cleared of involvement. The political scandal overwhelmed the actual investigation for years, and the intense focus on one man may have cost detectives valuable early time chasing the wrong story, while the real trail went cold. When was she found? Her skeletal remains were discovered more than a year later, in May of 2002, by a man walking his dog in Washington's Rock Creek Park. The location reframed everything. This had not been a disappearance tied to her private life, but something that happened in a public park, the kind of place she was known to visit. By then, though, the trail was more than a year cold, and the early obsession with the congressman had drawn attention away from other possibilities. It would take a newspaper investigation, years later, to push the police to look again. Who was charged? After a newspaper investigation prompted police to reopen the case, they arrested Ingmar Guandike, a Salvadoran man and reputed gang member who was already imprisoned for setting upon 2 other female joggers in the same park around the time Levy vanished. On paper, it seemed to fit. A known offender, the same park, the same window of time, the same kind of victim. The prosecution leaned heavily on a fellow inmate who claimed Guandike had confessed behind bars, and in 2010 he was convicted and later sentenced to 60 years. For a few years, it looked as though the long mystery had finally been put to rest, and the Levy family allowed themselves to believe it was over. So why is the case unsolved today? Because that conviction collapsed. A judge granted a new trial after it emerged that prosecutors had failed to disclose key information about their jailhouse witness, a man named Armando Morales, including his prior contacts with law enforcement, and that an investigator had secretly recorded him making damaging statements. In 2016, the government moved to dismiss the case, citing recent unforeseen developments, and a judge dismissed it without prejudice. The case that had seemed so solid was suddenly built on sand. Guandike was deported to El Salvador the following year, and the case reverted to officially unsolved, where it has remained ever since. Where does it stand now? The 25th anniversary of Levy's disappearance fell in May of 2026, a milestone marked by renewed coverage and lingering questions. Her parents have given recent interviews, even floating unsupported theories about what might have happened, a measure of how little certainty the family has ever been given. A young woman on the cusp of her career vanished from the heart of the nation's capital. A man was convicted and then freed. And after a quarter century, no one can say with confidence who was responsible. Levy's case was a single life and a decade of questions. The next took 13 lives in a single room in a matter of minutes. The Wah-Mee Massacre. Just after midnight in Seattle's Chinatown, in a private after-hours club hidden behind a locked door, 14 people were playing cards. Within minutes, all but one of them would be gone, in what remains the deadliest such event in the state's history. The Wah-Mee Club, inside the Louisa Hotel at the corner of Maynard Alley and South King Street, was a high-stakes after-hours gambling club popular with restaurant owners and well-known figures in the community, many of them connected to a local benevolent association. Entry was through a locked door by recognition only, which gave the place a sense of safety. It was an institution, the kind of room where regulars knew one another by name and had done so for years, a refugee at the heart of the neighborhood. On a February night in 1983, just after midnight, that very trust, the easy familiarity of a private club, was turned into a weapon against the people inside. What happened inside? 3 young men entered the club, hogtied 14 people with lengths of cord, and robbed them of their cash. Then the situation turned catastrophic, and 13 of the 14 lost their lives. It happened with brutal speed, the work of only minutes inside a room people had walked into expecting nothing more than a late night of cards. One man, a 61-year-old Navy veteran and card dealer named Wai Yok Chin, managed to free himself and stagger out into the alley for help. And he would become the prosecution's key witness. That he survived at all and could later identify the men responsible was the thread the entire case would hang on. Who were the 3? They were Quan Phi Mak, Benjamin Ng, and Wai Chu Ng, the last of no relation to the second. The motive was robbery, and the plan, investigators believed, had been to leave no one able to identify them afterward. It was a cold piece of arithmetic. Take the money and remove every witness in the room. One survivor undid that plan entirely, and the case became the deadliest such event in the state's recorded history. What happened to them in court? Their paths diverged sharply. Benjamin Ng was convicted in the summer of 1983 on 13 counts of aggravated first-degree homicide and given life without parole. His defense conceding his part in the robbery while arguing he had not planned to harm the witnesses. Quan Phi Mak was convicted that autumn and initially given a capital sentence by hanging, though that sentence was later overturned for ineffective legal representation. And after years of further proceedings, he was resentenced in 2002 to life without parole. The men who had planned the night down to the last detail would spend the rest of their lives behind bars. What about the third man? Wai Chu Ng fled to Canada and was added to the FBI's list of most wanted fugitives before being arrested in Calgary, working under a false name. His extradition was conditioned on setting aside the possibility of a capital sentence. He was acquitted of the killings themselves, but convicted on 13 counts of robbery and 1 count of inflicting harm, and sentenced to 30 years to life. The jury accepted that he had taken part in the robbery, but had not been among those who turned on the people in the room. Where do things stand now? Mak and Benjamin Ng both remain incarcerated for life in Washington state, with no successful appeals reported. Wai Chu Ng was granted parole in 2013 over the objection of the King County prosecutor. And in 2014, after serving 28 years, he was deported to Hong Kong under the terms of that parole. The building where the club stood was damaged by a fire years later and rebuilt. And a 40th anniversary retrospective in early 2023 revisited the neighborhood's long road to recovery. 13 people went out for a night of cards and never came home. And one survivor's courage in freeing himself and walking out for help, is the only reason the city ever learned who was responsible. The case is still taught as the deadliest such event in the state's history, and a quiet wound in a neighborhood that has never entirely healed. The Wah-Mee case ended with convictions and long sentences. The next, set far from any city on a quiet mountain trail, has never been solved at all. The murder of Susanna Stodden and Mary Cooper. A mother and her grown daughter set out for one mountain, found it too snowy, and chose a quieter trail instead. It was a small decision, the kind hikers make all the time, and it cost both of them their lives. Nearly 20 years later, no one knows who did it. Mary Cooper was a 56-year-old Seattle school librarian, married for 3 decades, and her daughter, Susanna Stodden, 27, was a devoted outdoors woman. They lived in Seattle and shared a deep love of the mountains, the kind of mother and daughter who spent their free days on the trails together. On a July morning in 2006, they planned to climb one peak, found it still snowed in, and switched to the Pinnacle Lake Trail near Granite Falls instead. It was meant to be an easy day out. What happened on the trail? They were last seen at the trailhead, chatting briefly with 2 other hikers. Around mid-afternoon, those same hikers found their bodies in a clearing roughly 2 miles up the trail. Both had been fatally wounded, and their clothing had been disturbed. There was no robbery that made sense of it, no clear connection between the women and any suspect, nothing that fit a motive at all. They had been on a public trail in broad daylight, the sort of outing thousands of people make every summer without a second thought. What did investigators find? The Snohomish County Sheriff's Office collected shell casings that pointed to a probable make and model of weapon, and recovered a partial male DNA profile. But that profile has never matched anyone in the national database. Mary's husband of 3 decades, David Stodden, was looked at early on, as relatives often are, but he was polygraphed and cleared. The trail offered almost nothing else. No witnesses to the act, no clear suspect, no motive that fit 2 women out for a walk in the woods. Were there any theories? Some have wondered about a known traveling offender who was active in the Pacific Northwest at the time, but no evidence has ever confirmed a link. The randomness is part of what has made the case so unsettling. 2 women on a public trail, in daylight, with no apparent reason to be targeted, met by someone who appears to have come and gone without leaving a trail of his own. There was no robbery, no ransom, no prior threat, nothing that connected the women to anyone who might have wished them harm. Detectives have long believed the answer is sitting in that partial profile, waiting for a name to attach to it, and that whoever did this may well have passed other hikers on the trail that very day without a second glance. Has the case stayed active? It has. A cold case detective took the file up and even revisited the trail with Mary's widower in 2025, describing how unimaginable it is that a quiet midweek hike could end the way this one did. The partial DNA profile remains the single most promising thread, and advances in genetic genealogy have solved older and colder cases than this one, including decades-old crimes in the same region. Where does it stand now? Nearly 2 decades on, the case remains unsolved, with the sheriff's office still asking the public for tips and keeping a dedicated line open for the smallest lead. A librarian and her daughter went for a walk in the mountains they loved, and the person who took their lives left behind only a fragment of genetic code that so far belongs to no one. For a family that has waited this long, the hope now rests on the same forensic genealogy that has cracked older and colder cases across the country in recent years, including decades-old crimes elsewhere in Washington. The shell casings, The partial profile and the memory of two hikers last seen smiling at a trailhead are all that remain, waiting for the day the science catches up to the name. Two hikers lost their lives on a trail, and the answer never came. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case reached back decades and into the corridors of power, where a painter with a dangerous secret met the same silence. The murder of Mary Pinchot Meyer. At midday, on a canal towpath in Georgetown, a woman out for her daily walk was fatally wounded in broad daylight. She had been, until a year earlier, the secret lover of the President of the United States. The man arrested nearby was acquitted. No weapon was ever found. And more than 60 years later, her case remains officially unsolved, tangled in some of the most enduring conspiracy theories in American history. Mary Pinchot Meyer was a Georgetown painter from a prominent family, the former wife of a senior intelligence officer named Cord Meyer, and the sister-in-law of a powerful newspaper editor. She moved easily through the most rarefied circles of Washington, an artist and a socialite who knew the people who ran the country, and who was, by some accounts, drawn to ideas and experiences far outside the buttoned-up world of early 60s officialdom. In the last years of his life, she had conducted an affair with President John F. Kennedy, a relationship that placed her quietly at the very center of national power. It was the kind of secret that, in the wrong circumstances, could become dangerous to know. And she kept a private journal that was said to record much of it. What happened that day? On the 12th of October, 1964, just 2 days before her 44th birthday, and only 10 days after the official report on Kennedy's assassination was released, Meyer was fatally wounded on the C&O Canal towpath at around 20 past noon. It was the middle of the day, on a path used by joggers and walkers in one of the most prominent neighborhoods in the capital. Two witnesses, a passing mechanic and an Army officer, reported seeing a man near her body, and police soon arrested a local man named Raymond Crump, found wet and disoriented nearby. Did the case against him hold? It did not. No weapon was ever recovered, and no forensic evidence tied Crump to Meyer. Defended by a pioneering black attorney, Dovey Johnson Roundtree, Crump was acquitted in the summer of 1965. The prosecution had a man at the scene, but it could not connect him to the act, and the jury had reasonable doubt. Then where does the mystery come from? From what happened to her diary? On the very day she lost her life, before police had even publicly identified her, a senior intelligence official was reportedly searching her studio for her private journal. Her brother-in-law later wrote that he had caught the same official picking the lock of the studio, and that the diary was eventually handed over to him and, by his own account, burned at intelligence headquarters. A private journal connected to a woman who had been intimate with the president vanished into intelligence hands within hours of her passing. And his account of finding the diary later clashed with what he had told the court at the time. What do people make of it? Theories have multiplied ever since. Some books, most prominently one published in 2012, argues she was deliberately silenced by intelligence figures because Meyer knew dangerous secrets about Kennedy's assassination. Other writers, after close study of the case, concluded that Crump most likely did it after all, pointing to a troubled and turbulent record in the years after his acquittal. The two camps have argued for decades, and because the one piece of evidence that might have settled it, her private journal, was destroyed, neither side can ever fully prove its case. The truth has never been established, and very likely never will be. Where does it stand now? The case remains officially unsolved. and the 60th anniversary in 2024 brought renewed attention and fresh writing on the mystery. The diary has never resurfaced. A talented artist who had moved through the highest circles of power was lost on a public path in the middle of the day. The one man tried for, it was set free. And the questions about who silenced her and why have outlasted nearly everyone who could have answered them. Pinchot Meyer's case dissolved into rumor and a missing diary. The next was the opposite, solved within days. But its motive was a delusion as dark as any conspiracy. The Goldmark family murders. On Christmas Eve, a man posing as a delivery driver knocked on the door of a prominent attorney's home in Seattle. By the time it was over, an entire family of 4 had been set upon. And over the weeks that followed, one by one, all of them would lose their lives. The motive was a political delusion built on lies. Charles Goldmark was a respected Seattle civil litigation attorney and a figure in state Democratic politics, married to Annie, a translator, and the father of 2 young sons. He was, by every measure, a pillar of his community, a man of standing and decency, with a young family and a thriving practice. His parents had years earlier won a landmark libel case after being falsely smeared as communists during an earlier era of political paranoia. A piece of family history that would, in a terrible irony, echo in what happened to their son. The lie that had once been used against the older generation would return, decades later, in a far deadlier form. Who came to the door? The man was David Lewis Rice, a drifter who had been drawn into a fringe anti-Semitic and anti-communist movement, and who had convinced himself that Charles Goldmark was a senior communist organizer and was Jewish. He was neither of those things. Rice had built an entire justification for what he was about to do out of beliefs that were simply false, fed to him by the propaganda of the group he had fallen in with. The cruel irony was that the Goldmark name had become a byword for standing up to exactly that kind of smear after the earlier libel victory. And now the same poison had circled back to take the family. What happened inside the home? Posing as a cab company delivery driver, Rice forced the family upstairs and restrained them, and all 4 were gravely harmed. The details are among the most disturbing in the state's history. And out of respect for the family and for the 2 children involved, they are best left unspoken. Over the days and weeks that followed, each member of the family lost their life to their injuries. The youngest first and the eldest son last, more than a month after that Christmas Eve. An entire family was erased. How was Rice caught? He was arrested within 2 days, after a housemate from the same fringe movement found a written confession he had left behind in a guest book. Rice then confessed on tape, describing what he had done and why. And the speed of the arrest meant there was never any real doubt about who was responsible. What remained in question was his state of mind, and whether a man so consumed by a false and hateful belief could be held fully accountable. That question would dominate the years of legal wrangling to come. What did the courts decide? In 1986, a jury rejected his insanity defense in under 5 hours and convicted him of 4 counts of aggravated first-degree homicide, and he was initially given a capital sentence. The speed of that rejection spoke to how the jury saw him, not as a man who could not tell right from wrong, but as one who had chosen to act on a hateful fantasy. That sentence was overturned by one judge, reinstated by an appeals court, and fought over for more than a decade until in 1998, Rice pleaded guilty in exchange for life without the possibility of parole. The long legal battle finally closed with the certainty that he would never go free. Where does it stand now? Rice, now in his late 60s, remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. In recent years, as extremist political attacks have returned to the headlines, the case has been revisited by commentators as an early and chilling warning about where extremist conspiracy beliefs can lead. A respected family was destroyed on Christmas Eve by a man acting on a fantasy. And decades later, the story endures less as a whodunit, which it never really was, than as a warning the country keeps having to relearn. The Goldmark case was extremism aimed at one family. The next would be terror with no pattern at all, fired at strangers from the trunk of a moving car. The D.C. sniper attacks. For 3 weeks in the autumn of 2002, people across the Washington region were afraid to pump gas, afraid to cross a parking lot, afraid to stand still outdoors. An invisible threat was striking people down one at a time, from a distance, with no warning and no apparent pattern, and no one knew where it would come from next. The attacks were carried out by John Allen Muhammad, a Gulf War veteran and trained marksman whose military record rated him an expert marksman, and Lee Boyd Malvo, a Jamaican teenager whom Muhammad had effectively taken from his mother in the Caribbean, isolated, indoctrinated, and groomed into an accomplice. The pairing of a controlling adult and a youth wholly under his sway would later become the legal heart of the whole story. Investigators came to believe Muhammad had a sprawling and shifting set of motives, from personal grievance to a vague larger scheme. But at ground level, the effect was simple and terrifying. No one could predict where the threat would come from next. How did they operate? Between the 2nd and the 22nd of October, the pair took the lives of 10 people and wounded others across Washington, Maryland, and Virginia, striking victims one at a time from a hole cut into the trunk of a blue sedan. The victims were ordinary people doing ordinary things: filling a tank, loading a car, mowing a lawn, sitting on a bench, crossing a parking lot. Among those lost were an FBI analyst named Linda Franklin and a Vietnam veteran named Dean Myers, people with no connection to one another beyond the random misfortune of being in the open. A wider trail of related crimes stretched back across several states and months, pushing the full toll even higher. Among the wounded was a boy struck outside his middle school, a moment that frightened the region as much as any, because it meant not even children at school were safe. How were they caught? On the 24th of October, the pair were found asleep at a rest stop in Maryland, after a nationwide alert had finally focused on their car, an old sedan rather than the white truck many witnesses had mistakenly described. Inside the car was the rifle that was ballistically linked to the attacks, and a hole cut into the trunk that explained how the shots had come from nowhere. The terror that had gripped millions ended with 2 men asleep in a converted vehicle at the side of a highway. What happened in court? Muhammad was convicted in Virginia, given a capital sentence, and also convicted in Maryland. And he was executed by the state in 2009, refusing to make a final statement. To the end, he offered no explanation and no apology to the families. Malvo, who had been a juvenile at the time of the attacks, was convicted in Virginia and given life, and later pleaded guilty in Maryland to further counts, receiving additional consecutive life sentences. His own defense had argued he was a brainwashed child acting under the total control of an older man, an argument that did not spare him at trial, but would resurface for years afterward. Why is this case still in the news in 2026? Because of Malvo's age at the time. Supreme Court rulings barring mandatory life without parole for those who were juveniles when they offended reopened his sentences, and a long legal battle followed over whether and where he could be resentenced. At one point, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the matter, only for the case to become moot after Virginia changed its parole laws for young offenders. Maryland courts then ordered him resentenced, but Virginia officials refused to transfer him, citing his record. On the 1st of May, 2026. The Appellate Court of Maryland rejected his latest appeal, finding the issue not yet ripe for review because his Virginia sentences come first. Where does it stand now? Malvo remains in a Virginia prison, serving consecutive life terms there before any Maryland sentence even begins, with his attorneys weighing further appeals. Even a successful resentencing in Maryland, the courts have noted, would be largely academic, because the Virginia time comes first. 2 decades on, the man who directed the terror is gone, and the youth he groomed has become the center of a continuing argument about how the law should treat children who do monstrous things under an adult's control. The snipers were caught, tried, and one of them executed. The next case, far quieter, has never had its day in court at all. The killing of Suzette Werner. She was found in a Spokane street just before dawn, more than a dozen blocks from where she had first been struck. The driver who did it backed up, got out with a flashlight, looked, and then drove away into the night. Nearly 2 decades later, no one has ever been identified, and the case remains one of the city's most haunting mysteries. Suzette Werner was a 42-year-old divorced mother of 2 grown daughters, a friendly, well-liked woman who had recently taken a bookkeeping job and was a regular at Casey's, a karaoke spot on North Monroe Street. Friends described her as warm and a little adrift at that point in her life, staying with various people around Spokane as she tried to get back on her feet, the kind of person everyone knew and no one worried about. On a February night in 2009, she left that lounge at around 2 in the morning and set off on foot, the way she often did, into the cold and the dark. What happened to her? Near an intersection in North Spokane, Werner was struck by a boxy dark SUV or van and dragged more than a dozen blocks before her body was found in the street around 4 in the morning, at a corner well away from where she had first been hit. Tests later showed her blood alcohol level was very high, more than 4 times the limit for driving, which may have left her unable to react in time. It was the kind of detail that might have made it look like a terrible accident, a pedestrian who never saw the vehicle coming. But it was not simply an accident, because of what witnesses described next. What did witnesses see? According to accounts gathered by police, the driver, described as a heavy-set tall man in a long jacket, backed up at the spot where she came to rest, briefly spoke to the driver of a teal station wagon that was passing, got out with a flashlight, looked, and then drove off. It is that detail that has always made the case so chilling. He knew what had happened. He stopped. He looked at her in the beam of a flashlight, and even exchanged words with another driver, before making the deliberate choice to leave her in the road and disappear. This was not a panicked driver who never realized what he had hit. It was someone who saw and decided to go. How hard did police look? Investigators pursued surveillance footage from gas stations along the dragging route and combed through phone records, hoping the brief roadside exchange with the other driver might surface a witness. By the end of that year, police acknowledged they had effectively run out of leads, despite a strong record of solving fatal hit-and-run cases in the years before this one. Her parents made a public appeal, even saying they forgave the driver, and begged him only to come forward and explain what had happened. No one ever did. And the second driver, the one the man spoke to that night in the teal wagon, was never identified either, leaving police without the one witness who might have seen his face. Where does it stand now? The case remains officially unsolved, with no arrest ever announced and no recent public update from Spokane police. It has been kept alive, mainly in a book on the state's notorious crime sites and on local cold case podcasts, where listeners still trade theories about the boxy, dark vehicle and the man with the flashlight. A mother of 2 grown daughters, walking home in the dark, was struck down and left in the road by someone who paused long enough to see exactly what he had done. and then chose to disappear. Somewhere, in all likelihood, that person is still out there. The only one who truly knows what happened on that street, carrying a secret that is held for more than 15 years. Werner's case ended with a driver who simply vanished. The last began with a man who, after the worst day in his county's memory, drove himself to the police and gave up. The Isaac Zamora rampage. Late on a September afternoon, a car pulled into the parking lot of the Skagit County Sheriff's Office, and the man inside surrendered without a struggle. Behind him, scattered across a small rural community and a stretch of interstate, lay the worst day of bloodshed the county had ever known. 6 people gone, 4 more wounded, in a span of hours. Isaac Zamora was a young man from the tiny community of Alger, with a long and well-documented history of severe mental illness, who had only weeks earlier been released from a short sentence for a drug offense. A court-ordered mental health evaluation had never been arranged, in part because he could not afford it, a gap in the system that would be examined closely afterward. His family had sought help for him repeatedly, and he had cycled through the courts and jails without ever receiving sustained treatment. He was a man the authorities knew well, and one who had slipped through every net meant to catch him. What happened that day? On the 2nd of September, 2008, Zamora broke into a neighbor's home and took 2 firearms, and then moved through the area, fatally wounding a sheriff's deputy named Ann Jackson, who had previously tried to help his family, and a local resident named Chester Rose, before wounding others and fleeing south on the interstate. Along that highway, he wounded a state trooper, who survived and took the life of a passing motorist named Leroy Lang, before driving to the sheriff's office in the county seat of Mount Vernon and giving himself up around mid-afternoon. When it was over, 6 people had lost their lives and 4 more were wounded, in a rural community where such a thing had been almost unimaginable. The deputy who was lost had been one of the very people who, over the years, had tried to get Zamora the help he so plainly needed. How did the courts handle a case like this? With a deal that reflected its strange and tragic nature. In 2009, under an agreement that took the possibility of a capital sentence off the table, Zamora pleaded guilty to 4 counts of aggravated homicide and not guilty by reason of insanity to 2 further counts, the 2 involving the deputy and the neighbor. He received 4 life sentences and was committed to a state psychiatric hospital for the 2 counts on which he was found not responsible. It was an unusual split verdict, holding him fully accountable for some lives and treating him as too unwell to be responsible for others. The state later paid $9 million to settle lawsuits brought by the victims' families over the failures that preceded the rampage. Did he stay in the hospital? No. In 2012, officials deemed him too dangerous for a hospital setting and moved him to a special unit within a state prison, the first such transfer of a committed patient under a then-new law. A judge had called him about as dangerous as it gets, and the system struggled to find any place that could safely hold a man who was at once gravely ill and an enormous threat. His case became a test of how the state should handle people who fall into the gap between the prison and the psychiatric hospital, belonging fully to neither. Where does it stand now? In 2019, Zamora moved to withdraw his pleas after the state abolished capital punishment, arguing the deal that spared him a possible capital sentence no longer made sense. But a judge denied the motion, and an appeals court upheld that denial the following year. He remains in custody under the joint authority of the prison and mental health systems, held in the special unit deemed secure enough for him. The case left a rural county forever changed and forced a hard public reckoning with how a man so plainly unwell and so plainly known to the authorities was left without the care or supervision that might have stopped one of the darkest days in its history. For the families of the 6 who were lost, that question of how the warning signs were missed has never stopped mattering. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.